Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today for this live stream here on my YouTube channel. My name's John. I'm also known as the Tattooed Historian by many of you, and I'm so happy to see so many of you who are interested in this topic today. And I'm so happy to have Marc Stein here to talk with us about his newest release. Marc, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
Marc is the Jamie and Phyllis Pasker Professor of U.S. History and Constitutional Law at San Francisco State University. He is also the 2026-27 President of the Organization of American Historians and Director of the OutHistory website, which I didn't put into the chat yet, but I will put that link in the chat as Marc is presenting today. His previous books include City of Sisterly and Brotherly Loves, Sexual Injustice, Rethinking the Gay and Lesbian Movement, the Stonewall Riots, and Queer Public History. Marc is here to talk with us about his research for his upcoming release entitled Bicentennial, A Revolutionary History of the 1970s, which comes out this month and is published by the University of Chicago Press. A link to the book is already pinned in the chat, so please check that out. That will be at the top of the chat. And I have a code for 30% off through the University of Chicago Press website that I'm going to be putting up above very soon here into Marc's presentation. And I know that Marc also has a QR code that you can scan later on in his slide deck. So I am so happy to have this kind of history on my channel. And it's been a long time coming. And as a Pennsylvania boy, I got to say, I read through a lot of this, and it brought back some memories of, going around Philadelphia area and seeing some sights. And Marc, I would like to ask you before we start the slide deck, what made you decide that the 1970s needed a revolutionary history?
Well, they're my teenage years, so I do have some memories, especially of the late 70s. I was born in 1963, and my first book was also about Philadelphia and finished in 1972. I concluded a book on Philadelphia gay and lesbian history with the first Gay Pride March in Philadelphia, but I'd actually planned on finishing that book in 1976, so I had collected a lot of research materials, and it had come in and out of my consciousness over the last 30 years. But with the US 250th coming up this year, I thought it was finally time to go back to that material, do new research, and let it take shape in book form.
Yeah, and the rhymes of history that I was reading in this book are fantastic, and I can't wait for you to showcase that to my audience. So I'm going to bring up the slide deck for you, Marc, and control that because I'm the one who's controlling the scrolling of the slides today, and I'm happy to do so. So Marc, take it away, my friend. Thank you again for being here.
Well, thanks again for the invitation, and I want to personally thank John for reaching out to me. As John mentioned, the book's just about out. I think the official publication date is March 17th. I have one of the first copies right here, so in a sense, this is kind of a pre-launch presentation, and it's also great because I know John is based in Ontario. For me to come back to Ontario, at least virtually, since I taught at York University in Toronto for 16 years before moving to San Francisco a little more than a decade ago. So John, if you don't mind advancing to the first slide. Great. So I'm going to just dive right in. This year, the United States is commemorating the 250th anniversary of its Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. Beyond enjoying the parties and parades, many will be celebrating the rejection of colonial rule, the challenge to monarchical authority, and the establishment of a new nation. Many also will be reminding themselves of what exactly the Declaration declared, that all men are created equal and have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that governments exist to secure those rights, and that legitimate regimes are based on the consent of the governed. They may be especially interested in revisiting the notion that people have the right to revolt when rulers abuse their powers. While the United States has failed to live up to its founding principles in countless ways, the Declaration's language has been invoked by millions in their aspirations for democracy, equality, and freedom. So next slide, please. 50 years ago, the United States celebrated its birthday in another period of international strife, political division, and economic instability. Then as now, many wondered about the relevance of the Declaration's principles. Then as now, the nation reflected on the meanings of its revolution in the aftermath of impeachment proceedings against an authoritarian president, judicial rulings about presidential powers, and public debates about democratic governance, fair elections, and the rule of law. Then as now, there was a crisis of confidence about national values. As the United States asks difficult questions about itself during the Semiquincentennial, there are lessons to be learned by looking back to the bicentennial. Next slide. National birthdays typically provide opportunities to revisit the past, reflect on the present, and plan for the future. They can be based on a politics of patriotic nationalism, but also can encourage engagement with complicated legacies. US birthday celebrations commonly feature bombastic statements about national greatness and boastful declarations about national exceptionalism. When the country's faults and flaws are acknowledged, they generally are incorporated into redemption narratives that portray the United States as moving toward the fulfillment of aspirational ideals. It is much rarer to hear patriotic insiders ask critical questions about nationalism in general or US nationalism in particular. Next slide. The celebration of the bicentennial was marked by dramatic failures and tremendous successes. The planning process, lasting almost 2 decades, was extremely dysfunctional when President Richard Nixon was in power. Proposals were developed and discarded, promises of support were made and broken, politicians used and abused the bicentennial for partisan purposes. The situation improved in 1974 after Nixon appointed John Warner to lead the American Revolution Bicentennial Administration. Over the next 2 years, ARBA supported thousands of projects, and a massive project of bicentennial civic volunteerism took shape. Next slide. In the absence of generous government funding, however, Warner and other planners turned to corporate partners and promoted do-it-yourself initiatives, only to find themselves attacked for bicentennial commercialization. Indigenous people, people of color, colonized people, and women debated how and why the United States should celebrate and how and whether they should participate. LGBTQ people were not invited to the birthday party, but many came anyway, demanding inclusion in the body politic. For those wishing to emphasize national greatness, it didn't help that the lead up to the bicentennial included the nation's worst military defeat, the unprecedented resignation of a president, a sustained economic recession, and an explosive energy crisis. Yet ARBA managed to pull off a celebration that was widely praised. Next slide. Philadelphia experienced the bicentennial in unique ways. The city where the Declaration was written was designated, but then denied a primary role as the celebration's focal point. Grand plans for an international expo were announced and then blocked. Federal funding was publicly promised, secretly reduced, and repeatedly withheld. President Gerald Ford figuratively said drop dead to New York when it was facing bankruptcy in 1975. But just before that, he essentially said the same to Philadelphia when it asked him to honor Nixon's funding promises. Meanwhile, African Americans, representing 1/3 of the city's population, participated in the planning process, but organized a series of counter-bicentennial demonstrations, beginning in 1969. They were joined by others who had reasons for challenging the official celebration. In and beyond Philadelphia, grassroots political groups, including the People's Bicentennial Commission and the July 4th Coalition, made new meanings out of the bicentennial. Next slide. Philadelphia planners envisioned the summer of '76 as the culminating season of their celebration, but confronted an array of challenges: a campaign to recall Mayor Frank Rizzo, job actions by city workers, budget crises that led to cutbacks in government services, the largest tax increases in local history, and unrealistic predictions of a tourism boom. While millions visited Philadelphia in 1976, millions stayed away after Rizzo asked Ford for armed troops to protect July 4th celebrants from what he termed leftist radicals. On the big day, tens of thousands of activists participated in counter-bicentennial marches, demanding a bicentennial without colonies and a national commitment to democracy, equality, and justice. A few weeks later, more than 180 people were struck down and 29 killed by Legionnaire's disease, a type of pneumonia named for the American Legion members whose convention at Philadelphia's most prestigious hotel accounted for most of the victims. The hotel closed several months later. Next slide. While Philadelphia's commemoration was disastrous in many respects, it was successful in others. The city's bicentennial agency supported thousands of projects, many organized by diverse ethnic, racial, and religious communities. The National Park Service completed multiple projects at Independence National Historical Park in what is commonly known as America's most historic square mile. The city's museums, historical societies, and arts organizations sponsored major initiatives. New cultural institutions, including groundbreaking African American, ethnic, and Jewish museums, were established. Visitor numbers fell far short of expectations, but the millions who came far exceeded the numbers that had visited in preceding years, and the growth rate bested the city's bicentennial rivals. Next slide. Today, millions of locals and travelers experience a city transformed by the bicentennial. They benefit from infrastructure projects associated with the celebration and work in an economy greatly influenced by bicentennial-inspired tourism. They are educated and entertained by artistic and cultural projects that originated in that era. They are surrounded by historical houses, landmarks, museums, and parks that were created or recreated as part of the commemoration. They also participate in or are influenced by social justice coalitions that criticize the official bicentennial, challenge the nation's understanding of its past, and contributed to democratization. Like all major U.S. urban centers, Philadelphia today is deeply divided and troubled, but there is no denying the lasting influence of the bicentennial on one of the nation's great cities and on the United States more generally. Next slide. Today I'll be concentrating on one of the main arguments of my new book, that the bicentennial was a key moment in the history of democracy. At national and local levels, public officials and bicentennial planners attempted to control the commemoration narrative, but were challenged by grassroots movements, which asked difficult questions about celebrating the nation's founding in the context of historical and ongoing inequities. "We are the bicentennial," one activist declared. Others fought for a people's bicentennial or a bicentennial without colonies. The authors of the books Roots and Gay American History, the artists who produced Philadelphia Freedom and the Bicentennial Blues, the organizers of the first National Archives Conference on Women's History, and the participants in the Native American Trail of Self-Determination presented new ways of thinking about the nation's past. Counter-bicentennial activists also formed broad coalitions, belying the notion that the left collapsed and divided in the 1970s. My book follows their lead, presenting a democratic history of a democratic bicentennial. Next slide. The earliest powerful challenges to the official bicentennial came from African Americans. In 1969, Edna Thomas, leader of Philadelphia Women for Community Action, and I have to say this photo on the top left is one of my favorites in the book, initiated a campaign against the local Bicentennial Commission's plans for an international expo. With support from a broad range of African American groups, Thomas staged multiple demonstrations with an emphasis on four concerns: underrepresentation of people of color on planning agencies, inappropriate spending priorities amid widespread poverty and unemployment, displacement and disruption for African American neighborhoods, and a lack of attention to Black history. In the end, Thomas's campaign contributed greatly to the defeat of the proposal for an international expo and the opening of Philadelphia's groundbreaking Afro-American Historical and Cultural Museum in 1976. Next slide. On the national level, African Americans made similar arguments. Founded in 1970, for example, the DC-based Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation lobbied for the designation of more National Historic Landmarks at sites associated with Black history. By the end of 1976, they had increased the number from 2 to more than 70. Another initiative launched by the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History succeeded in replacing Black History Week with Black History Month. Next slide. In 1975, writer Alex Haley, who served on the National Bicentennial Commission's advisory board, observed, "Blacks are not going to be as gung-ho about celebrating as whites. They're not going around saying, 'Wow, great, we were slaves in 1776. Haley nevertheless noted, "Blacks have just as intensive a stake in the country as anyone else. I have a great sense of pride in the role Blacks played in the creation of this country." In 1976, Haley's Pulitzer Prize-winning book Roots, which chronicled the author's search for his family origins in African freedom and American slavery, successfully used the bicentennial to transform popular understandings of the past. As Michael Dyson later wrote, since it was published during the nation's blithely romantic celebration of its bicentennial, Haley's book provided a touchstone for alternative history. Haley's book helped conscientious citizens to challenge the self-image of America as an unqualified champion of democracy and freedom. Next slide. Far more confrontational were Richard Pryor's album Bicentennial N-Word, and he used the real word, and Gil Scott-Heron's poem Bicentennial Blues. BN, which I'll call it, which won a Grammy for Best Comedy Recording, was a devastating critique of US racism and bicentennial obliviousness. One track, titled Bicentennial Prayer, used the voice of a Black preacher to declare that "we are gathered here today to celebrate this year of bicentenniality in the hope of celebrating 200 years of white folks kicking ass." Scott Heron's Bicentennial Blues asked why the blues were so at home in the United States. His answer referenced capitalism, racism, and slavery. Next slide. Notwithstanding the primary roles played by African Americans in early and sustained critiques of the official bicentennial, mainstream media stories focused more on the challenges posed by white new leftists, who relentlessly attacked the BUY centennial. On the national level, the People's Bicentennial Commission, founded in 1971 by Jeremy Rifkin, received the most attention, in part because it borrowed attention-grabbing tactics from the counterculture. "We intend to rekindle the true revolutionary spirit of '76, Rifkin declared, and remind the public that the founding fathers included some far-out agitators, including Thomas Paine, who spoke for the propertyless underclass, Benjamin Rush, a left-winger who signed the Declaration of Independence, and Sam Adams, who helped arrange America's first guerrilla theater, the Boston Tea Party." The commission's goal was to pursue the unfulfilled goals of the unfinished American Revolution and unite white, Blacks, Latins, Native Americans, the middle class, workers, and poor people around a common revolutionary heritage. The mission was succinctly captured in the title of Rifkin's 1971 manifesto, "The Red, White, and Blue Left." Next slide. Over the next few years, the PBC was both panned and praised for its educational materials and its media-savvy protests. In 1973, it disrupted a reenactment of the Boston Tea Party by staging a Boston oil party, seizing a replica ship in Boston Harbor, running up banners pleading for the impeachment of President Nixon, and dumping empty oil barrels into the water. In 1974, it showed up for the launch of the American Freedom Train in Virginia, booing President Ford and chanting, "Long live the American Revolution." As Rifkin declared, the people who are protesting here today are the sons and daughters of liberty. Those people on the platform are the heirs to King George and the aristocracy. In 1975, 45,000 supporters of the PBC disrupted the commemoration of the battles of Lexington and Concord, calling for a declaration of economic independence from corporate America, labeling Ford a Tory and asking, "Who the hell elected you?" In 1976, at a Senate hearing, 60 PBC activists dressed as clowns, fat cats, Minutemen, and pigs were removed after they began waving signs that read, "Declare your independence from big business." As police escorted them out, they read from the Declaration of Independence, played kazoos, and sang "Happy Birthday." Next slide. Feminists were the next major group of critics, pledging to participate, but objecting to their second-class status in commemoration planning. In 1972, Women for the Bicentennial, a newly formed group in Philadelphia, promised to support renovation projects at Independence Hall and in Fairmount Park, but picketed a meeting between Philadelphia's mayor and Pennsylvania's governor to demand a greater voice for women in the bicentennial. In 1973, 10 women's organizations from around the country participated in a bicentennial conference in Philadelphia, which led to the formation of the Women's Coalition for the Third Century. According to its president, the American dream has not yet come true for women. Women are not in the history books, and today we are for the most part outside the decision-making process. Later that year, at a second national conference, representatives of more than 50 groups demanded that 50% of National Bicentennial Commission staff positions be given to women and called for the establishment of a National Women's History Center. Next slide. The center was not established, but in 1975, the National Archives opened a groundbreaking exhibit titled "Her Infinite Variety, a 200-year record of American women." First Lady Betty Ford visited the exhibit in October, shortly after she had made feminist waves when speaking about the Equal Rights Amendment, passed by Congress in 1972, but not ratified by the required number of states. In addition to confirming that she had encouraged her husband to appoint women to the cabinet and Supreme Court, Betty Ford called for the ratification of the ERA. Next slide. Notwithstanding the First Lady's advocacy, journalist Marcy Schatzman warned, "When Uncle Sam throws his birthday party next year, women may find they never received an invitation. Philadelphia alone has spent millions on the planned celebration, but not one special event is scheduled here for women." In an 11th hour attempt to correct that omission, a group of women asked the Pennsylvania Bicentennial Commission to fund a Bicentennial Women's Center in Philadelphia. A short time later, at the National Organization of Women's annual convention in Philadelphia, Representative Bella Abzug, pictured here on the right, declared, "We are going to complete the American Revolution and make it a revolution of men and women." Next slide. In 1976, feminists continued to use the bicentennial to advocate for women's history. In April, for example, the annual conference of the National Archives focused for the first time on women. The papers were later published as "Cleo Was a Woman: Studies in the History of American Women." Back in Philadelphia, the Bicentennial Women's Center opened in April. Described as the country's only comprehensive bicentennial project on women, it hosted multiple activities and events over the next 6 months. Its guiding questions asked, what part did women play in the revolution? How can we square the status of women with the ideals of the Declaration? What are the objectives of the women's movement 2 centuries later? In the end, the United States did not add the ERA to the Constitution in 1976 or later, but feminists used the bicentennial to advocate for gender equality and women's rights. Next slide. Native Americans approached the bicentennial with divided loyalties and complicated agendas. While some nations agreed to become official bicentennial communities in exchange for government grants, others were more critical. In 1972, Thomasine Hill, a student newly appointed to the National Bicentennial Commission, declared at a Senate hearing, that we Indians have little to celebrate because we lost a country. She nevertheless argued that if the commemoration promoted cross-cultural understanding and illuminated American diversity, that would be a great gift. At the same hearing, the Smithsonian's Director of Indian Awareness shared a statement adopted at a recent gathering of Native American leaders. Participation of Native Americans in America's bicentennial should not be a celebration of the past, the statement argued, for no American can truly celebrate the events of Sand Creek, Washita, or Wounded Knee. Excuse me. Neither should this be a celebration of the present, for who can celebrate the unemployment, the bad health, and the poor housing which characterizes the lives of so many American Indians? Instead, this must be a celebration of a new beginning. Next slide. In 1973, a Native American student club at the University of Arizona organized a national bicentennial conference, which was attended by 150 people representing more than 30 tribes. The conference report, Indians and 1976 Native Americans Look at the American Revolution Bicentennial Observance, tried to capture the diversity of viewpoints represented at the gathering, where some wanted a separate Indian bicentennial funded by the National Commission. Others supported a counter-celebration to mark the centennial of the Battle of Little Bighorn, and still others favored a boycott. Later that year, American Indian movement leader Vernon Bellecourt observed, "The Declaration of Independence spells it out pretty precisely. When a government becomes a tyranny, it's not only a duty, but a responsibility for the people to attempt to change that form of government. A bicentennial is going to take place in 1976. We, the hosts, haven't been asked much about our involvement. If conditions did not change," he warned, "it will be our duty to blow out the candles on that 200th birthday cake." Next slide. In 1975, representatives of 24 tribes met with President Ford at the White House and John Warner at ARBA headquarters. Pointing to a reproduction of the Declaration of Independence on the wall, one visitor told Warner, "Look at all those words. Justice, 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 justice. We've never had any of that justice. And now you people want us to celebrate?" When ARBA administrators presented their guests with bicentennial lapel pins, another visitor responded sarcastically, "Hooray, here comes the beads and trinkets." Most of the leaders complimented Warner's outreach efforts, but there was no mistaking the bitterness in their voices when responding to his calls for participation. Next slide. Native Americans had strongly critical reaction to the wagon train pilgrimage, a project that called for each state to sponsor Conestoga wagons that would cross the country and arrive in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania in time for July 4th, 1976. While one tribe temporarily blocked the wagons to demand tribal recognition, the Survival of American Indians Association, based in Washington State, organized the Native American Trail of Self-Determination, which followed the wagon train in cars. Inspired by the 1972 Trail of Broken Treaties, the organizers hoped to meet with President Ford on July 4th. As Chicano poet Raul Salinas explained, "We are following the bicentennial wagon train because we're protesting what it symbolizes. For the Indian and Mexican peoples, it's been 200 years of cultural genocide." Next slide. In June 1976, Native Americans marked the centennial of the Battle of Little Bighorn, widely recognized as the worst U.S. military defeat in its wars against indigenous people. According to the New York Times, while 150 Native Americans danced joyously around the monument to the 7th Cavalry dead, 500 people attended a National Park Service ceremony to mourn the U.S. military losses. In a gesture of reconciliation, a park superintendent asked a Sioux chief to dedicate a wall that featured the words of 13-year-old Black Elk, who had participated in the Battle of Little Bighorn. "Know the power that is peace." Next slide. Latinos responded to the bicentennial in distinct ways, in part because of their deeper connections to Spanish colonialism, and in part because of the colonial status of Puerto Rico and the Panama Canal Zone. In 1974, the League of United Latin American Citizens and 7 other Latino groups criticized national bicentennial planners for ignoring their issues and displaying no interest in projects for Spanish-speaking communities. In 1975, when ARBA sponsored a conference where 400 participants established the Bicentennial Ethnic and Racial Council, a Latina activist noted that ARBA should stress the Hispanic colonization of America equally with the British colonization. Later that year, Latinos participated in a reenactment of the 1775-1776 expedition of Juan Bautista de Anza from Orcasitas, Mexico to San Francisco. The reenactment concluded at San Francisco's Presidio, where 1,600 locals greeted 50 reenactors, several of whom claimed the region for Spain. Today, de Anza is seen as a genocidal colonizer and enslaver, but in 1976, his expedition was celebrated. Next slide. Another reenactment commemorated the 1776 expedition of Atancio Dominguez and Silvestre Bayles de Escalante, Franciscan priests who had attempted to travel from Santa Fe to Monterrey. According to Raul Castro, Arizona's first Mexican-American governor, the bicentennial is a time for people to recognize that this country is great because everybody made a different contribution. Mexican Americans, Blacks, Indians, and Orientals. This has been ignored in our history books. Castro continued, what went on in Philadelphia in 1776 is meaningless here, especially for a guy like me who came from Mexico. The Anglos are celebrating the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock. The Mexican Americans are looking at the Spanish settlers, but their patriotism and love of country are the same. Next slide. Many Latinos and Latin Americans were less enthusiastic. As the bicentennial year began and foreign nations rushed to congratulate the United States, the Organization of American States declined to do so. As one official explained, how can anyone expect Latin Americans to salute the United States for 200 years of history, which contains so many chapters of putting us down? He continued, I'm talking about such things as Teddy Roosevelt and the Panama Canal. The feeling is America is great because it exploited the rest of us. Journalist Gary Wills echoed these sentiments, writing that the saddest prospect for the new year of 1976 is that we may be celebrating the bicentennial of our colonial revolution while we try to crush the spirit of independence in our colony of Panama. Next slide. Puerto Ricans were especially active in using the bicentennial to challenge U.S. colonialism. In 1974, Puerto Rican Socialist Party founder Juan Marie Bras called for a bicentennial without colonies before an audience of 20,000 at a Madison Square Garden rally in New York. Bras declared that the bicentennial was a magnificent historical opportunity to convert the celebration planned by imperialists into a great movement that would support independence for his island. A small number of activists supported more violent resistance. In January 1975, Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional Puertorriqueña bombed a New York tavern that had been an important gathering place during the American Revolution. 4 people were killed and more than 50 injured. In response, the U.S. government embarked on a campaign of repression that failed to distinguish between violent and nonviolent critics. In November, a Senate subcommittee claimed that Puerto Rican leftists, backed by the Cuban government and the Soviet secret police, planned to disrupt the 1976 bicentennial celebrations with a campaign of terrorism. 6 months later, on July 1st, Representative Ron Dellums of California, pictured here on the bottom right, introduced a Puerto Rican self-determination resolution in the House. The resolution reminded the United States that in 1776 it had made a commitment to the principles that all colonial people have the inalienable right to self-determination. The resolution didn't pass, but Dellums succeeded in highlighting the hypocrisy of commemorating an anti-colonial revolution while exercising colonial authority over Puerto Rico. Next slide. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders had similarly diverse way of engaging with the bicentennial. For many Pacific Islanders, the key issue was U.S. colonialism, which prompted both celebration and criticism. In January 76, the New York Times reported that the first bicentennial celebration of the year was a flag-raising ceremony on Guam. 6 months later, the Times reported that the last bicentennial event on July 4th was a festival on American Samoa. Many Pacific Islanders felt literally and figuratively distant from the bicentennial, but in May, the Polynesian Voyaging Society commemorated the nation's birthday by setting out on a 6,000-mile round-trip voyage between Hawaii and Tahiti. Sponsored by Hawaii's Bicentennial Commission, it did so in a replica of the type of canoe that may have been used by Pacific Islanders to reach Hawaii more than 1,000 years earlier. 34 days later, the Hakulea was greeted by 10,000 Tahitians. A similar number greeted the canoe's return to Hawaii in July. Next slide. Other Pacific Islanders were more oriented to critique. In July 1976, separatists from the Marshall and Palau Islands, administered by the United States as a UN trust territory, called for independence. As one island leader told the UN, "At a time when the United States is celebrating the end of colonial rule by Britain, it should not play the role of colonizer." Next slide. In Philadelphia, Chinese Americans also celebrated and criticized. In 73, activists began staging protests against the planned demolition of Chinatown's Holy Redeemer Church, which was in the path of the new Vine Street Expressway, a bicentennial infrastructure project. According to a local Asian American newspaper, good news to City Hall means putting in new expressways and ramps in time for the bicentennial, whereas good news for us means preserving the uniqueness of Chinatown. 1 year later, as the fight to preserve Holy Redeemer continued, an Inquirer headline was headlined, "Chinatown Fights for Its Life." Next slide. Chinese Americans also fought for inclusion in Philadelphia's main celebrations. On New Year's Eve in 1975 and New Year's Day in 1976, when horrible winter weather disrupted the festivities at Independence Hall, some blamed the fact that local officials had turned down a request to participate by the Chinese Cultural Center's Philadelphia Dragon Club, whose mascot was hoping to welcome the Year of the Dragon. As one observer noted about the bad weather, it shows what can happen when you anger a dragon. 2 months later, the Chinese Cultural Center launched a series of bicentennial banquets. The first featured dishes such as the Melting Pot, Thomas Paine's Pleasure, and Dolly Madison's Delight. In May, a local newspaper reported that Chinatown would be dressed up in bicentennial finery for July 4th. Banners, streamers, and flags would proclaim in distinctive Chinese characters that there's something to celebrate in the enclave just northeast of Independence Mall. Crosswalks would be painted in red, yellow, and green, traditional Chinese colors, and a mural would celebrate the Year of the Dragon. According to the Chinese Benevolent Association, however, bicentennial planners had failed to consult with the local community and presented the banners in ways used by the Chinese to mark the death of an elderly family member. Next slide. Another conflict erupted in June when the Bulletin reported that young men in the Dragon Club were breathing fire about their mistreatment. First, the city had turned down their request to be included in the July 4th parade, claiming that their dragon wouldn't fit in. In response, the club argued that the parade should celebrate all 200 years of the country's history and not just the first, and should highlight the variety of cultures that make our country unique. Parade organizers eventually relented, but stipulated that the club could participate as part of the international division. "We're American," one Dragon Club leader tried to explain. "We don't want to march as a foreign country." As of June 27th, it was unclear whether the Dragon Club would march in the parade's international or Pennsylvania division. But a few days later, the club was reassigned to the Pennsylvania division. Next slide. In contrast to the other groups mentioned so far, LGBTQ people were not invited to the nation's official bicentennial birthday parties, but they crashed the festivities. In 1973, when activist Marc Stein handcuffed himself to a banister overlooking the Liberty Bell in Independence Hall, he explained that he wanted to make the point that gay people have no liberty. Later that year, more than 100 gay activists participated in the Boston Oil Party with a large banner that proclaimed, Gay American Revolution. In 1974, gay singer Elton John wrote Philadelphia Freedom to celebrate both the bicentennial and his friend Billie Jean King, a lesbian who played for the Philadelphia Freedoms, a professional tennis team. That same year, the Philadelphia Inquirer Sunday magazine published Gay Philadelphia. The magazine cover featured two powdered men in 18th century white wigs and pink colonial drag. The tagline referred to the gay revolution in the cradle of liberty. The subtitle declared that homosexuals were demanding that the Bill of Rights signed here nearly 2 centuries ago finally be applied to them. The article began by noting that the gay equivalent of the American Revolution took place a scant 5 years ago at a bar called Stonewall. 1 month later, Philadelphians celebrated gay pride by signing a gay Declaration of Independence at Independence Hall. Gay newspapers described Mark Siegel as the John Hancock of the movement, and Siegel called the Stonewall riots the Boston Tea Party of the gay movement. Next slide. In 1975, gay activist John White commented on the bicentennial after he and his partner were attacked, and they're pictured here on the right, at the American Way, a massive Philadelphia celebration that commemorated the convening of the Second Continental Congress. Tom and I were walking arm in arm around the booths, enjoying ourselves, but getting the usual number of stares, he explained. Then a group of teenagers began harassing them. One threw a beer bottle that hit White on the back of his head. I'm getting a little turned off to this commemoration of 200 years of freedom, White noted. Why didn't the festival have a booth for racists, one for anti-Semites, one for sexists, one for homophobes? It is, after all, the American way. Next slide. Beyond Philadelphia, more than 450 people participated in a bicentennial conference on gays in the federal government in D.C. More than 800 attended a Metropolitan Community Church conference in D.C. to affirm the rights of gay people to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In several instances, LGBTQ people asked for support from state and local bicentennial agencies. In 1975, Rhode Island activists, in a project called Toward a Gayer Bicentennial, initiated ultimately successful litigation after they were denied permission to use the old State House for a gay Congress. Meanwhile, one pair of performances circumvented the Philadelphia Bicentennial Agency's unofficial ban on LGBTQ programming. Song of Whitman, staged behind the Museum of Art, was developed by John White's partner, Tom Wilson Weinberg. The script featured Whitman's most homoerotic texts, a fact that Weinberg conveniently and strategically omitted when he applied for official recognition. Next slide. LGBTQ people also responded to the bicentennial with campy, patriotic, political, and subversive art, as the examples presented here show. They also joined the Bicentennial by promoting LGBTQ capitalism, commerce, and tourism. Mandate, one of the country's leading gay porn magazines, published a 3-part feature that boosted the campaign to promote bicentennial gay tourism to Philadelphia. The first part, Philadelphia Freedom, explained early patriots fought for it, the founding fathers declared it, Elton John sang about it. Freedom has been the major theme in a bicentennial year, and Mandate traveled to the bicentennial city, Philadelphia, for location shooting of winter fashions. The pages that followed featured photographs of handsome men dressed in fashionable clothing and positioned at well-known historical sites. The second section, Penn's Men, included 4 photographs of nude men and captions with risque bicentennial jokes. The third part, The Philadelphia Story, offered a tour of the local gay scene. Written by a local impresario, Henry David, this section included photographs of clothed and unclothed men, including one at Independence Hall. Mandate's feature showed that LGBTQ people were participants in the Bicentennial and were committed to queering the nation's 200th. Next slide. They also were inspired by the bicentennial to promote what community-based scholar Jonathan Ned Katz termed gay American history. In January 1976, The Advocate, one of the country's most widely circulating gay periodicals, published a groundbreaking set of articles on gay history, previewed by an advertisement featuring a lipsticked George Washington. As publisher David Goodstein explained, even for gay Americans, 1976 is a bicentennial year. The history of gay people for the past 200 years has been one of invisibility. In this issue, we share what we've been able to find out about our past. An introduction noted, whether you support it, protest it, treat it as a joke, a celebration, or a solemn occasion, one thing's sure, you won't be able to avoid the bicentennial. Whatever each of us decides to do or not do about the bicentennial, it's increasingly clear that we need to know more about our contribution as gay people to the nation's history. We need to know more about our past so we can create a better future. Next slide. Later in the year, Katz's Gay American History, a compendium of hundreds of primary sources, was published. While Katz's introduction didn't directly address the bicentennial, the book was published in 1976. Its title linked gay history with U.S. history, and the book included multiple texts from the nation's founding era, including documents by and about Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and Deborah Sampson. There also were documents featuring optimistic predictions about the bicentennial by Walt Whitman and critical comments about the bicentennial by the founders of the group Gay American Indians in San Francisco. In many respects, Gay American History attempted to do for queer history what Roots did for Black history, use the bicentennial to reconsider, reconstruct, and reimagine the U.S. past. And next slide, as I move toward my conclusion. When July 4th, 1976 finally arrived, counter-bicentennial activists marched and rallied in broad-based coalitions, challenging the politics of the official celebration. In DC, thousands participated in an independence rally for economic democracy, while the Trail for Self-Determination prepared for a protest at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Native American protests led to multiple arrests and police violence. But a week later, President Ford met with Native American leaders at the White House, where he promised to pursue legislation giving tribal governments greater legal jurisdiction on reservations. The July 4th coalition staged demonstrations in Los Angeles, San Antonio, San Francisco, and Seattle. But the largest was the Bicentennial Without Colonies protest in Philadelphia, where 40,000 people marched and rallied. There also was a feminist march in support of the ERA and a trio of demonstrations at suburban churches by a group calling themselves Dykes for an American Revolution, which had authored a lesbian feminist declaration of 1976. The July 4th coalition brought together a diverse array of more than 400 groups, including the American Indian Movement, the Black Panthers, the National Coalition of Gay Organizations, the National Organization of Women, and the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. While the mainstream press minimized the size and significance of counter-bicentennial demonstrations, alternative media praised the nonviolent protest for their coalitional politics and their powerful arguments in favor of taking seriously the Declaration's commitments to democracy, equality, freedom, and justice. A few months later, in the presidential elections of 1976, the United States declared independence from the Republican Party of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. And I'll leave it at that. And I hope I haven't taken too much of your time, but I look forward to whatever time is left for Q&A and discussion.
Thank you so much, Marc. That was amazing. Greatly appreciate all the slides. They're awesome. I'm so glad we could get them uploaded and up here on the screen for everyone.
Yeah, and absolutely. And if I may, there's one slide. I want you to just be on it for a second. So this just places myself in the narrative. This is me at age 13 in my childhood bedroom. And if you don't mind, I don't mind if you move quickly past that one. So I don't want to embarrass myself too much. But here's the promised QR code for a book discount.
Yes. If anyone is seeing this on their PC or anything like that, or watching on television, I know some of you like to watch these things on your television. You have the ability to scan that QR code. If you don't, I have this up here so you can see it's UCP new. Please go to the link that's pinned in the chat. That at 30% off is only good at the University of Chicago Press's website. So please go through that link and use that discount, UCP, new, all capital letters, to get 30% off of this particular book. And I highly recommend it. Obviously, I highly recommend it. And I'm so glad that Marc is here to be able to speak with us about that. I did have a starred thing, Scott Grimwood. Hello. I was on the official bicentennial committee in my elementary school in 1975, 1976. Marc, do you want to touch on that for a moment? How deeply invested even local schools were with this idea of the bicentennial?
Yeah, I think I was on the similar thing, hence the costume in my own school, which was just an hour north of New York City. No, I think it's amazing to look at the final report of ARBA to see the thousands and thousands of projects around the country. And, you know, in some respects, it did a decent job of dealing with ethnic and racial diversity, reaching into schools, reaching into the military, reaching into Native American reservations, and you know, it was really everywhere. It was everywhere.
Yet Scott also followed up with bicentennial focused on what happened in 75 and 76. I don't recall a lot of official focus on the time periods in between. It's interesting because your photo, Marc, is also that kind of the way your positionality with it is concerned is you're looking at the 75, 76 as a young kid being placed in that position. It's not really looking at some of the things that we just discussed, which is really interesting when it comes to cultural history and historical memory.
Right, right. Yeah, and I was completely unaware of all of this
Sure.
oppositional politics, you know, in my own community. I have no memory of that. Actually, my family's only summer vacation outside of the United States was in the summer of '76 when we went to Montreal and Quebec and Ottawa. So my, you know, my family wasn't particularly invested in what was going on, but yeah, I don't know if part of the question is kind of addressing, like, there were two approaches. One is let's focus on the revolutionary era, and the other, as we heard in the voices of Asian Americans, was let's celebrate the entire 200 years of American history, right? And it was understandable for lots of communities that became larger in the 20th century, you know, to want to favor an approach that called on a commemoration of the full 200 years, right? And then there's the issue of the, you know, the Revolutionary War process, you know, arguably played out over 20 years or even longer. And similarly, the commemorations continued. There was a commemoration, for example, of the U.S. Constitution, you know, in the 1980s. So, and as my research kind of showed, the planning process for the bicentennial actually began in the late 50s, and it began to pick up in earnest as we hit all of the kind of well-known bicentennial markers, you know, so 73, 74, 75, 76, right? So each thing, Continental Congress, the Concord and Lexington, Boston Tea Party, each thing was commemorated. So it really did spread out over several years.
What would be your message as far as having this book out 50 years later and the social movements that we still have and ideas of what equality really means, what freedom really means?
Right.
What would be some of your messaging concerning that for your readers?
Well, I was really struck by how fast the major July 4th coalition protest came together. And in working on the book, I was concerned. I saw very little very little evidence that a lot of counter-bicentennial activism was emerging on a level comparable to what occurred in the 1970s. And I was really worried about what it would mean to celebrate the semi-quincentennial in the way that the Trump administration and the Heritage Foundation want to celebrate it. But then I reminded myself that the July 4th coalition protest came together in basically 6 months. So, and I have begun to see kind of more signs of more alternative and counter-bicentennial plans. And then we're getting kind of close, so I don't know that I see anything that's going to be singular. I guess even the July 4th coalition wasn't really singular. There was a People's Bicentennial Commission protest in DC, and protests kind of scattered. But I think there's still time, and I think maybe one of the No Kings demonstrations, I hope that the No Kings movement is really thinking about July 4th and thinking about the summer as a time, for counter-bicentennial programming.
I know that I have some peers up here in Ontario and Quebec who, when the whole 51st state phraseology started to come about, where they went back to 1775 and they said, hey, remember the Battle of Quebec? And I thought, they're probably the only people on the continent right now who are thinking about 1775 in that manner. And
I actually have a line in the book about the commemoration in 1975, about that. And there was lots of international participation in the bicentennial. And Canada, there was a reenactment stage of that battle. And also the Shaw Festival sent, I guess there's a Shaw play about the American Revolution, so sent that to Philadelphia, where it was performed, I think, at the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. So there were moments of kind of engagement, and then I have a story actually about the border cities of Calais, Maine, and God, I always forget if it's St. Stephen. I think it's St. Stephen. That had a long-standing, apparently it's an invented history tradition involving exchanging gunpowder on, I think it's July 4th. So I tell that story. And I have a friend I lived in Maine for many years, and I have a friend there who is the one who helped me understand the history of that tradition, or the invented history of that tradition. There Canada comes up in a few parts in the book.
We have another comment real quick from the chat. So thank you everyone who's in the chat. David said about the year before when Saigon fell and the Vietnam chapter was closing, he believes that could be a reason for somewhat muted celebrations in the aftermath of this national and world trauma. What are your thoughts on that, Mark, with that consideration?
Yeah, I think that was definitely an important context, Watergate and Vietnam both. But the dominant sense I get, like from the media coverage in 75, 76, was that a perception that the bicentennial would allow for a turning of the page. There was column after column about how the bicentennial would allow us to put those ugly episodes behind us, right? That was the hope. I don't think we can say it really played out that way. But absolutely, it played an important role. It was a kind of deflection away from the national trauma and the memory of failure, really. But there was also, especially with respect to Watergate, like a certain kind of pride that the discourse was often the system worked. Right. And even though the system had also led to Watergate, but I think there was an effort by national political leaders to say, look, we had an election, we turned Ford out of office, we got coerced essentially Nixon to resign, right? And so, the Congress, unlike today, actually stood up to the president, right? As did the Supreme Court, unlike most of the time today, right? So, so there was that connection with Watergate, and the fact, another popular culture episode that I talk about is Rocky. Rocky's set in the bicentennial year, and Rocky has commonly been seen as kind of capturing a post-Vietnam moment, and I guess maybe that's more Sylvester Stallone and Rambo, but so maybe I'm stretching here, but I think it together does represent kind of an effort to turn the page.
Yeah. Reminder to everyone in the chat as we wrap up here that a link to the book is pinned in the top of the chat. We also have the 30% off code available to you. I'll put it in the description after we wrap up. But again, that is UCP new, and that is only through the link or only through University of Chicago Press's website. So please use that for 30% off of this particular book. And as we wrap up, I want to ask you, Marc, one last thing. Since you are the president of the Organization of American Historians, and I'm a fan of OAH, could you let everyone know what the OAH is who may not know?
Sure. Well, I should clarify. I'm the president-elect. I become the president at the end of our annual convention in Philadelphia, which this year happens to be in Philadelphia in April. So I guess it's about 6 weeks away. Yeah. So the Organization of American Historians is the largest professional organization of U.S. and early American historians. I think we have about 6,000 members. We run an annual conference, a journal called the Journal of American History. We've been issuing a lot of statements about recent threats to the practice of history and to the work of historians. So we have an advocacy side, but several publications in addition to the quarterly journal, and run lots of online programs that people definitely should check out on a diverse set of topics related to U.S. history. And yeah, and I'm really honored and proud to be assuming this position, and among other things, first person primarily associated with queer history to be the president of the OAH, and first person in quite a while, arguably forever, to be teaching at a non-elite institution. I teach in the California State University system, and so I know my system and my colleagues are really proud that following other presidents from Harvard and Yale and the Smithsonian, that that again, Democratic Bicentennial, the Democratic history profession is being represented with my leadership.
And that's fantastic. Yeah, shout out to the OAH for all their advocacy work. It's much needed now more than ever, and I'm so appreciative of organizations who do stand up for history and stand for good history, and they're doing a tremendous job. And congratulations on your election, Mr. President. I hope everything goes swimmingly for you at the April convention, and have some fun with that.
Thanks, and everybody should come. I get to deliver my address at the end of my year, and that convention will be in my current hometown of San Francisco. So I think there's still a couple months for people who might be interested in proposing sessions for the conference. I think the deadline is in April, and even if you're not on the program, we're doing everything we can to have a really great program and great turnout.
Yes, I still have to go to my first one, so. Maybe that'll be the one.
Yeah, it's a great city to visit.
Yes. Well, Marc, thank you so much for coming on and spending time with us and doing such an amazing slide deck and presentation. It really means a lot to me, and I'm sure it does to everyone in the chat.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. Please take care of yourselves. Be well, be good to yourselves, and keep reading.